Let's take every main JoJo villain and put them into JoJo-tsu Kaisen. Who would be the most formidable opponent? I did this with the main JoJos in the last video, and here I'm going to do something kind of similar but change the criteria a bit. In that video I simply made them sorcerers, basically part of a Joestar clan. Here I'm going to up the stakes. We'll be using the same ideas in terms of how their powers are translated to JJK, just like last time where their powers got turned into cursed techniques and Shikigami, as well as covering potential domains that they might have, if any. But since most villains have abilities that would make them special grade by default, we won't just theorize their grade. We're going to give them a challenge too. We'll be seeing who's the most unstoppable and who has the most potential to defeat every sorcerer in JJK. One thing people mentioned for the last video is that I shouldn't restrict strong abilities to domains, so I'll clarify that here too. We'll only be doing that if their technique specifically is befitting of a domain. But for anyone without something like that, we'll theorize something unique for them. For example, like in the last video with Johnny where he had very specific conditions to reach his maximum power, those are cases in which we can limit those powers to a domain, because they're not going to have them all the time. Although, with the villains it's kind of different because they're pretty overpowered in terms of their hacks. Thanks for the feedback on the last video too, it really helps and it's going to make this one better. For the first section we'll cover their abilities, and for the second we'll cover how far they can make it in JJK. Mainly we'll be looking at who their toughest opponents are, specifically if there's any hard counters to them or who they hard counter the best. At the time of recording this video, we don't really know much about the Part 9 antagonists, so we'll just be going parts 1 through 8. And no other stuff like Heavenly Ascension Dio, it's just going to be the canon villains. And as a disclaimer, just like last time, this is not a power scaling video. This is basically us making original JJK characters from the JoJo characters. We're translating their abilities into JJK, and it's not representative of actual power scaling. This is just a fun theoretical video. Let's start with Dio from Part 1. We will be covering Part 3 Dio later, but let's separate the two of them, especially because everything we cover here will apply to Part 3 Dio as well. I had two ideas for how his ability could work. Either he has some sort of heavenly restriction that makes him a vampire by default, with the restriction being that he's weak to sunlight, or he becomes a vampire through the stone mask, a cursed object. But let's go with the first one. His heavenly restriction is vampirism. He's granted all the amazing powers that he has, and he's exceptionally strong. Although his critical weakness is that he's weak to sunlight, and instead of Hamon being a weakness, I guess we could translate it into a very specific weakness to curse energy. In the last video, we translated Hamon into being perfect curse energy control. So how about here for one of Dio's weaknesses, alongside the fact that he can't go out in the sun? He's exceptionally weak to black flashes. With other cursed energy attacks, it works just like any other person. But given the concentration of energy within a black flash and how strong it is by default, Part 1 Dio here has an extra weakness to that. That's also an Achilles heel for him, part of his heavenly restriction. Black Flash's weakness is one good option, but there's something even better and more fitting to give him a weakness to: reverse curse technique. His restriction can essentially just treat him as a cursed spirit rather than a human. His regeneration will work like a cursed spirit too, rather than a sorcerer, so it's not going to be reverse curse technique regeneration. Given that Dio has the properties of cursed spirit here, while not actually being a cursed spirit, his restriction in turn would make him weak to reverse curse technique when used defensively against him, and that fits perfectly with how we treated Hamon in the last video, translating it into perfect cursed energy control as well as reverse curse technique. And now that I'm recording this, it's really weird how well this fits and the similarities between Hamon and RCT, as well as how we're applying it here in this video and the last one, both offensively and defensively. Keep note of this going forward. It applies to Dio through his restriction, as well as two other characters that we'll cover. But thanks to that heavenly restriction, he gets some great abilities with it. Surprisingly, no blood manipulation was part of his abilities in the actual JoJo story, and I almost thought maybe we should give him that here because that's fitting for JJK, but he already has a ton to work with. As a vampire, he has some crazy abilities such as temperature control, hypnosis, necromancy, and chimera creation. And the fact that he could even survive as a severed head. His regeneration will be so advanced that you have to specifically destroy his head. So even if you decapitate him, he can still regenerate. And even with the heavenly restriction that makes him weak to sunlight, he can overcome this by creating a veil, which basically turns the sky into nighttime. Or obviously he could just stay inside. Interestingly enough, he basically has Kenjaku's ability too. Part of his vampirism allows him to cut off someone's head and replace it with his own, which he eventually ends up doing with the sorcerer of the Joestar clan, Jonathan Joestar. As for a domain, there's two things we could do here. We could either limit the world to a domain because he hasn't fully manifested it yet, or we can give Part 1 Dio a unique domain such as having his own castle, allowing him to summon a limitless army of undead chimeras. I feel either of those examples for a domain work. But before we go to Part 3 Dio, let's go next to cars. And since we're only covering canon stuff, this is going to be main series cars. No George Joestar. Although it would be pretty funny to cover novel cars. Considering that Cars isn't technically a human, how about in JJK's verse we consider him a cursed spirit? Dio and a lot of the other villains later, they'll be actual sorcerers. Except for Cars and someone who we'll get to later, who will be considered cursed spirits here. We'll say Cars has a binding vow with himself. This can actually be used by cursed spirits. And let's say Cars makes a gamble here. Just like in JoJo how the Pillarman wanted to wipe out anyone who used Hamon, here Cars aims to wipe out any Jujutsu users. And as a cursed spirit, which tends to come out at night anyways, he decides to limit himself. It'll be like a more severe version of Nanami's overtime. In the daytime, or more specifically in sunlight, he's weak. But in exchange, he has way more power at nighttime, or rather, under the effects of a veil. One thing to note for Cars is that he could heal as is without reverse curse technique, and he'd also be weak to it as well. Cars here is actually a cursed spirit, so by default his Hamon weakness from the original series, it translates into RCT weakness here. Once more, perfectly fitting. He would just regenerate through other means instead of using RCT, given the fact that he's not actually a human sorcerer and rather a cursed spirit, which also explains why his regeneration is so crazy. And his goal is to find two cursed objects, the Stone Mask and the Red Stone of Aja. And these two cursed objects combined come with a great power. Although, it requires stabbing your face with the Stone Mask, which is pretty painful. For Cars, no issue though. With his goal of getting these objects, it'll retain the great power of his binding vow, but remove the weakness from it. There would be a price to breaking this vow, but this gets around it essentially. Which would mean these would be highly coveted objects by any sorcerer, except for the face stabbing part. The Red Stone will empower your cursed technique, and when wearing the Stone Mask, it gets around the binding vow. But the two of them combined can completely counteract it, so you won't even need to wear the Stone Mask. I guess we could also say the Stone Mask and Red Stone combined, they give him the properties of a sorcerer rather than a spirit, which is why he loses his RCT vulnerability, and the weakness to sunlight as well. It basically lets him get the upsides of being a human sorcerer, while also keeping the upsides of being a cursed spirit. The best of both worlds. Not only are we translating Cars into the series here, but also these two objects, which I think is pretty fitting for him and his abilities. On top of the great power he has from his vow, his curse technique would be something like Mahito combined with Megumi, with the power to transform parts of his body into animal parts. But on top of that, he can create actual living creatures that are separate from his body. And with both of these objects, not only does he counter his binding vow, but his abilities increase significantly. As for Domain, another good comparison would be Chimera's Shadow Garden from Megumi, but a better version. Actually, more like Dagon's if anything. And he'd probably be the type to have a domain by default given how smart he is and how powerful he is. He'd be able to figure out how to create one pretty quickly. His domain will let him create limitless life forms that could also transform themselves too, coupled with a guaranteed hit effect of course. This is pretty much something he could do naturally anyways, but in this domain, he could do it a lot more efficiently, and he can control the animals a lot more effectively. Like, remember in part 2 how his feathers turn into piranhas to attack Joseph? It's gonna be like that, but these animals will be a lot more intelligent. And they could transform on their own too. He could do some crazy shit like have a crow fly into someone and then have it turn into a piranha, and then into a shark. He'll have raw power, great abilities, and have this all boosted by the Stone Mask and Red Stone of Aja. Overall, a pretty deadly cursed spirit, even when his vow still has the downside. Now on to part 3 Dio. He's pretty easy to sum up, so we won't spend too much time on him, because he has all the abilities we explained for part 1 Dio, plus everything from Jonathan that we explained in the last video. The only big issue with him is that after he takes possession of Jonathan, his possession takes a little bit more to kick in. Unlike Kenjaku, he has a condition with his, whereas Kenjaku's is that he has to show his scars. Dio's condition is that he needs the blood of someone else from the same bloodline. He's still powerful as is, but if he wants to awaken his true potential, when taking possession of someone, specifically Jonathan in this case, he's going to require the blood of someone else in the Joestar bloodline. Thankfully, he has a lot of Sorcerer Joestars to fight. And similar to what we did with Jotaro, the world will function as a domain for him here too. Although one thing people point out in the last video is that I completely overlooked the fact that the domain should imply he has some sort of base technique related to this too. So there's a couple ways to go about this. 1. Time Stop is a domain, and the world's actual technique is simply super speed and super strength, just as it works in JoJo. 2. Dio and Jotaro are like Higuruma or Hikari, whose powers are dependent on actually using the domain. This is kind of what I was going for with Jotaro in the last video, and I think this is the most reasonable way to go about this. 3. Time Stop's a domain, and the world simply has some sort of separate ability related to Time Stop and is something that could be used outside of the domain. Or 4. Time Stop is the cursed technique, and the domain is simply a more powerful version of that with a guaranteed hit. Not that a guaranteed hit would really matter in most cases since the target's just stopped in time. I think options 2 and 4 are the most reasonable for this, and they fit with the mechanics of domains in JJK, as well as not drastically changing the abilities as is. But let's go with explanation 2. The world is a domain, as well as his cursed technique. It's like Hikari or Higuruma where he has to activate it when he wants to use its power. Outside of his domain, of course, he has the great strength of the world, plus his own vampirism abilities. And in JoJo, it's made clear that Jotaro, and Dio by extension, they can't just spam time stops. Otherwise, they could just chain time stops together and they'd be able to stop time indefinitely. So this kind of fits with domains too, where they can't just simply spam them. Although, given how differently his curse technique works from others, he's able to use domains more than the average person, without completely overloading himself, but it's not like he could just spam them back to back. Essentially here he's more comparable to Sukuna if anything. Just as Sukuna needed all his fingers back for a full power-up, Dio incarnates into Awakened Dio when he consumes part of the Joestar clan, more specifically taking their blood. And he's the ultimate enemy to the Joestar clan of sorcerers. Next, Yoshikage Kira. And for him, we will be ignoring Stray Cat because that's not his ability, that's a separate creature entirely, so none of Stray Cat's abilities will apply here. Yes, we could use Stray Cat as a Shikigami or something, but we'd basically be covering a separate character entirely. It's its own living being after all. Of course, its curse technique is Killer Queen, Anything that his Shikigami touches will be turned into a bomb if he desires. He could also deploy Sheer Heart Attack, which will be a durable Shikigami based on heat. It's going to be a powerful attack, I guess similar to Mei-Mei's Crows, that most people can't simply counter. You either have to defend against it, or outsmart the heat-seeking somehow. Pretty straightforward ability as part of his technique here. But then we get to Bites of Dust, which is a little more, well, specific. This ability is kind of strange to put into a cursed technique, especially because 1, it required him to be stabbed by the arrow again, and it's also born from a very specific desire to be anonymous. Although even with the specifics of it, there's no point limiting it because of how specific the circumstances are. Just like the other characters, we're going to use him as his full power, so we will look at Bites the Dust. I was wondering whether or not for Kira we should have the arrow be an actual cursed object. So that's also an option, but then we'd have to change how the arrow works for everybody else. At least for those who've used the arrow before. So it's simpler to just not include that as a thing, I guess. And if Kira is still a serial killer in this verse, then I guess we could say this ability works the same, even with how specific Kira's desire was in the moment to manifest this ability. Bites the Dust is a technique he could bestow on someone. But instead of a time loop that basically affects, well, everything, let's say it activates a remote domain instead. And just like how Bites the Dust works normally, we'll say that while this is active, Kira can't use Killer Queen unless he withdraws this. When he's fighting regularly and he activates a domain, it simply causes the target to be bombarded by explosives. It'll probably be some domain that lets him spawn a bunch of Sheer Heart Attacks. Ones that are faster and aren't based on heat. Plus it's similar to Mahito's in the sense that once he gets in contact with you, you're dead. And the guaranteed hit effect of this domain will make this a lot easier on top of that. But when he activates Bites the Dust, it restricts him from using his domain or curse technique as part of a vow. When it activates, we can say it goes by the same logic that it stops people from finding out his identity, or instead of making it so specific, we could also just have it so it activates a remote domain, with the trigger being that someone finds out his identity. So this gives Kira 2 interesting ways to fight. He could either use Killer Queen as is, and he has a domain where he can make a bunch of Sheer Heart Attacks, or he sacrifices that in order to make this a lot longer ranged. So even when he's not near you, his curse technique can activate at any time, which would leave him vulnerable, but also it makes it a lot easier to sneak attack people. But again, due to how specific everything is with the circumstances here, this is still a bit strange to put into a domain or technique, so comment below how you think this domain would work, specifically Bites the Dust. There are a lot of specific abilities in JoJo, and this one's really specific, in terms of how it activates, how it works, and what the effects of it are. That's at least my idea of how we can translate it into it, but I'd like to see what you think, so let me know below. You have to kind of tinker with this one a lot more. By the way, if you're enjoying this video and want to see more like this, be sure to drop a like and hit that subscribe button. Next is a pretty interesting case in Diavolo and Doppio. And yes, we're including Doppio here because I had a pretty interesting idea of how this could work. So obviously in JoJo, Doppio is an alter ego to conceal his identity, which actually did work pretty well. Once again, we can make use of a vow here. The vow is Diavolo can completely conceal himself, assuming the identity of Doppio. This manifests a new personality for him, and even somewhat of a different build for his body, plus an instant change in his facial structure and his hair. So this vow lets him create a completely separate identity, which helps him stay anonymous, with the downside of the vow being he can only lend parts of his curse technique to Doppio. And when he communicates with Doppio, Doppio has to use some sort of object as a phone. This feels pretty fitting for a vow, and it lines up pretty perfectly with how Diavolo actually acts in JoJo. So that at least covers the Doppio part. What about the actual curse technique? His curse technique is King Crimson. And it's worth mentioning here he does have Epitaph too, because some people theorize that this is part of Doppio's ability, but it's just a sub-ability of King Crimson, and it's not something exclusive to having Doppio be a separate person. Sorry for the tangent, but it's worth mentioning because someone will probably bring it up here. But Epitaph is just a sub-ability of King Crimson, so it still would be part of his curse technique here too, even with how Doppio works differently here in this theoretical video. It's like how Killer Queen has Sheer Heart Attack as a sub-ability. Anyways, tangent aside, we all know what King Crimson does. And once more, this feels like something that fits perfectly for a domain, and it would be one of those techniques that activates with a domain. Outside of the domain, he could use Epitaph, which, although up to interpretation, it still lets him see events in the future. But when he activates King Crimson, it activates as a domain where he cuts out time. Of course, outside of his domain, he still has the power of King Crimson as a Shikigami, but for the most part, he's going to try and conceal himself and act as Doppio. And while he's not going to be using his raw destructive power naturally, he excels in stealth attacks. Anyone caught in his domain won't realize they're caught in a domain, because by the time it deactivates, well, they're just dead. The downside to his domain is that it's more expansive than other ones, so while it does have guaranteed hits, if he catches multiple people in the domain, and they make it out alive, they could actually figure out what happened. So Diavolo would prefer to trap one person in a domain at a time. This is basically what happened in part 5 as well, where he was mainly fighting Bruno, but everyone else was affected by King Crimson, and they saw the strange effects of it firsthand. It's an incredibly deadly and stealthy ability, especially with the fact that he's going to maintain anonymity. Sure, he's not going to have raw destructive power outside of the domain, but if you're within his range and you don't realize he's there, and for some reason you get on his bad side and become a target, he's obviously a very formidable opponent, and even more so because no one realizes he's an opponent. Pretty straightforward at least. Unlike the next person, Pucci, who is not going to be as straightforward because he essentially has 3 stands. Yeah, of course they are part of an evolutionary line, but for him we kind of have to cover 3 different versions of Pucci as a sorcerer. But we can make it fit pretty well in this verse too. especially through the use of cursed objects again. Especially with how he unlocks Sea Moon and eventually Made in Heaven. Version 1 of Pucci will be White Snake Pucci. His Shikigami could actually take people's cursed energy, not just their techniques, their energy too. And he could also transplant them between people. We could also have it work like Geito's cursed spirit manipulation, in the sense that he could do this to people weaker than him. For curses, this kills them instantly, and as for sorcerers, it turns them into normal people. Plus, on top of this, he has the ability to create illusions that White Snake has. This may sound overpowered, especially because he's basically Higuruma without any limits of how he actually takes people's energy. But the downside for him is that anyone could take their disc back. So he would have to safeguard these pretty closely. And this doesn't just apply to their disc, they could take someone else's disc if he happens to have it. And for this first version of Pucci, we could say Sea Moon actually does come into play, at least when he has a domain. Sea Moon already kind of works like this anyways because it's a specific area where he can control gravity. His domain wouldn't actually have a barrier and it'd have a massive range, kind of like Malevolent Shrine does. Plus, to some extent, he could be able to control his speed in this domain, since that is how Made in Heaven works. By speeding up gravity, that's him controlling time and speed. But for this first version of him, it would be to a much lesser extent. But even with this being the weakest version of him, he'd still be a very terrifying opponent. He can create illusions, he could flat out stop your abilities and your energy, and he'd have a pretty impressive domain. The only downside is, unlike Geito, it's not like he's going to be able to deploy the disc as actual cursed spirits because he never did this before. He needs somewhere to actually plant it into, so this is useful for killing cursed spirits, but it's not like he can deploy them after the fact, unless he gives their ability to someone else. Really, it's best for cancelling out other people's abilities, and he'd have to rely a lot on White Snake's trickery here. For version 2, we'll use Sea Moon as his base. This is obtained after Dio gets the cursed object of Dio's bone, and is able to successfully mutate it into the green baby. So in a way, Dio's bone kind of works like Sukuna's finger, eventually incarnating into the green baby, and then empowering Pucci's cursed technique or anyone else who's able to do this. So in this case, it leads to Sea Moon. So instead of the Sea Moon abilities being restricted to his domain, it's actually part of his regular cursed technique. I'm noticing a pattern where we could translate a lot of JoJo objects into cursed objects in JJK. It does translate pretty well. Anyways, for this version of Pucci, his domain will be Made in Heaven, which is restricted to this domain. And this domain is basically Sea Moon turned up to 11. He can control gravity so well that it speeds up the flow of time, and it could speed up himself as well. Not only does he have the guaranteed hit in this domain, but he'd be nearly impossible to hit as well. And anyone trapped in this domain will be subject to his time control, as well as his gravity warping, of course. This version of Pucci feels like the most sensible translation of his powers too, because we get to have Made in Heaven, but it's not just going to be his base, especially with how specific the steps are to actually achieve Made in Heaven. But we will do one more version of Pucci, version 3 with Made in Heaven as his base curse technique, Pucci's final evolution, and obviously his most overpowered one. Now, one thing that might inhibit it when we translate it to this verse is the fact that, since his technique would just be dependent on how much cursed energy he has, Made in Heaven might not actually be as crazy as it was in JoJo. If he had the 6 eyes or something, sure, but even though in JoJo he was able to speed up the entire universe and give himself infinite speed, if we're making it a cursed technique here and it's actually dependent on cursed energy, it may end up being limited to some degree, at least when he's not in a domain. Having it rely on a defined energy means that it can run out. But still, even if this limit does exist to it, he's one of the most terrifying opponents by default. And just like with Pucci, we could do the same for Valentine where we make 2 different versions of him, hinging on the use of a cursed object as well. And don't worry, I'm not going to spoil part 7, just the specific abilities that Valentine's able to achieve. Version 1 of him gives him the cursed technique Dirty Deeds Done Dirt Cheap. As for a domain, it could be an area where he could freely travel dimensions. Instead of having to be between objects, he could just do whatever he wants here, basically letting him teleport infinitely and exchange with other versions of himself. And one thing we've done so far, kind of like we saw with Pucci, is the fact that all these cursed techniques are going to rely on cursed energy, since everyone's now abiding by JJK's rules, and the way they use their Shikigami or their techniques actually will drain their cursed energy, rather than just actual stamina. But for Valentine, this actually won't be an issue. Through a technicality, he could basically have infinite cursed energy, so if he's ever injured or if he just runs out of cursed energy, he can simply swap with another version of himself. And if you get caught in his domain, you're basically screwed, because if he's able to do this infinitely with no limits to where he could actually teleport, well, once you're in his domain, he's unkillable and has infinite cursed energy, plus guaranteed hits on you. Granted, he's not going to have any crazy offensive techniques, he's just going to fight regularly. But one offensive technique that he can actually rely on is having people interact with their alternate selves, which would insta-kill them. And again, couple this with the domain. If you get caught in his domain, he could just introduce you to a parallel version of yourself and insta-kill you. Outside of his domain, he'd be really hard to kill, but it's not impossible. But in his domain, he basically wins by default. And then with version 2 of him, which is where we give him Love Train as well, this is a version of him where he evolves his cursed technique, and he does this by getting cursed objects, parts of the Saint's corpse. Essentially working like Sukuna's fingers here. Besides the fact that the Saint's corpse can actually give you access to his stand, some of them give you their own unique abilities too, which would apply to him here. So this is how we'll translate it here and explain how he gets Love Train eventually, if he were to achieve that in this verse. If you thought he was overpowered already, with this cursed technique in addition, it basically gives him an offensive version of Gojo's Limitless. At least to some extent. It blocks any misfortune coming his way and directs it elsewhere, albeit at random. Plus, it has the ability to make any other attacks fatal. by having them travel to somewhere in the body where it would be fatal, and it could even warp the environment around him to his favor. At least for that ability, I think that would be befitting of a domain, so in this domain once he has Love Train, he has the Misfortune redirection, but on top of that he has a barrierless domain where anything around him, at least anything without cursed energy, it could be shifted around to his favor. So, in simplest terms, with Love Train he basically has a version of Gojo's Infinity that teleports any misfortune away, and for his domain, he has the same abilities, plus he basically has Laws of Room from One Piece. One Piece videos are coming soon, by the way. And finally, we end off with Tooru. And since he's also from an unadapted part, we're going to keep the spoilers light here. But there is one spoiler I kind of have to mention, and it's the fact that he's a rock human, so just like we did with Cars, we can consider him a cursed spirit because he's not technically human here. Just like Cars and Dio, Tooru is also weak to reverse curse technique here, given the fact that he's going to be a cursed spirit here rather than a human sorcerer. And to explain his ability in short, anyone who pursues him is attacked by Calamity, a force that he controls. His stand is basically Unluck from Undead Unluck. I just wanted that reference in there. And also on top of him being a cursed spirit, he's kind of like the disaster curses because he's representing Calamity here. Given how prevalent Calamity is as basically a force of nature, that would translate into him having a lot of cursed energy as a cursed spirit, given how much people would fear Calamity. So physically he might be on the level of Mahito or Jogo, which would mean he's definitely outpaced by the other people later in the series, but his ability itself is pretty deadly. If anything, this is a true offensive version of what Gojo has, except there's no defense here. The defense is offense. If someone tries to attack him, they're then attacked by Calamity. Any object in their surroundings can be turned into something deadly, and then used against an enemy. And since he's unique in the sense that he's a cursed spirit here, while also having a stand of his own unlike Cars, instead of Wonder of You being a Shikigami for him, we could say Wonder of You is more like a transformation for him, kind of like how Mahito has his transformation. And that would be his true essence here. And when you think about it, he actually doesn't really need a domain, because his ability as is kind of works like one anyways. It'll summon any object from nearby and turn it into a weapon. Even something like a light bulb could be turned into a weapon, or a raindrop. If he had a domain, it would just be this but stronger. So in this sense, Calamity basically is his domain. His curse technique is essentially one that's always active around him, and when someone enters the domain, that's when they're attacked by Calamity. So that's the way we'll translate it into JJK here. So now that we've translated everyone into JJK and shown what their abilities would be like, who would make it the farthest and who would be able to actually eliminate every sorcerer and cursed spirit? We'll start from the top with Dio Brando from part 1. Of course he has the weakness to sunlight, so there's multiple ways of defeating him that way. Plus, the weaknesses to black flashes, that's going to be really tough for him to counter. He has a very versatile moveset, but special grades could take him on or someone could give him a nice dose of RCT. The issue is circumventing his regeneration. And again, some of the special grades here should be able to do something like that. Yuta Enrico with a Love Beam, Yuki with a Black Hole, Gojo with Hollow Purple or his domain, or Sukuna, if he hits him with the Dismantle to the head, or just puts him in his domain. Someone like Araume might even be able to actually defeat him, because yes, while Dio can manipulate heat, it requires him to actually take it from somewhere. So what's he going to do if Araume just freezes his head? Just like any other strong person in JJK, the best way to kill them is just by destroying the brain. There's also plenty of Culling Game players that could stop him too. Kashimo has a good shot, same for Higuruma. Actually, especially Higuruma given all the crimes Dio's committed. Next on to Cars. While he might not have some crazy hacks, his raw strength helps him a lot. And since I just mentioned Higuruma, Cars would be a perfect counter here, because yes, Higuruma could just take away his cursed energy and such, but his raw strength would still be enough to counter him there. For someone like Gojo, it might lead to a stalemate because he doesn't really have a way to get through his Limitless. Although interestingly enough, I think there's a chance he could counter Infinite Void, because while this overloads your brain, his brain's not a normal brain. He's so much smarter and more developed than a normal person that this might not even affect him. He could probably just tank it, funny enough. So even Gojo would have a tough time trying to defeat him. And unlike Dio, Sunlight's not just going to kill him, it will just turn him into stone. The question is how far his regeneration would take him here. If we go with the statement from Stroheim that cutting someone into 1 centimeter squared pieces could actually kill him, then Sukuna could actually kill him. Dismantle would be perfect for this, but he might actually need to be completely destroyed because there's also a statement saying that the dust in their body's alive. And this was for Santana, the weaker Pillarman. Cars is the strongest of them even before he gets the Stone Mask and the Redstone of Asia. His ability itself isn't too hard to fight against. The issue is killing him, because of how much raw power he has and how good his regeneration is. His regeneration makes Hikari's Jackpot look like nothing in comparison, which is stated to be the best regeneration in JJK. The special grades would have a really tough time with him, but they might be able to find out some way to kill him. Especially Gojo, who still won't be affected by him. And might be able to kill him with his domain, but even that's not guaranteed, given how much better his brain is than a normal human. Cars' major weakness, of course, is RCT, but when he becomes the ultimate thing, that's really a non-factor, although if he's caught before that, any sorcerer that could effectively use RCT offensively should be able to deal with him pretty easily. Same goes for both versions of Dio, but at least for Cars, once he gets both objects and becomes the ultimate life form, he completely loses this weakness. But beforehand, that leaves him weak to people like Yuta, for example, or anyone like him who could use RCT offensively. As for Part 3 Dio, it's basically everything we said for Part 1 Dio. And since we're still connecting it to the last video, you'd either need one of the special grade sorcerers or someone like Joseph. Of course, there's no Jonathan here because in this case, Jonathan's dead. But if we have the sorcerer Joseph here, Given how we translated Hamon and how it works with Dio's weakness here, Sorcerer Joseph would be a good counter for him. He'd be a much tougher opponent than Part 1 Dio, especially with access to the world. But if you could predict that the world is coming, you could fortify yourself enough to maybe withstand one of his attacks. And in terms of killing him, there's multiple ways of going about it that the special grade should be able to do, and also a couple Culling Game players. Once more, Higuruma especially is a good counter here because if he gets Dio in a domain, that could be an insta-win for him. Next on to Kira, who'd be one of the easiest to counter on this list. He lacks the raw power of someone like Kars, and his hacks rely on very specific circumstances here. For the most part, he'd have to rely on his bombs or his domain. And just like Mahito, all you'd have to do is avoid contact and then Killer Queen won't really be a problem to you. Sheer heart attack's another thing. But still, there's ways to counter this. While it is highly durable, it's not completely indestructible. Jotaro even did damage it a bit. So maybe some of the stronger special grades could just simply destroy it. Or a more easy scenario, try and just guard against the explosion or outsmart the heat seeking. Or in Gojo's case, just stand there. That doesn't affect him. His domain is an issue too, and the fact that he's going to be sneak attacking people with the remote version of it. But overall, pretty easy to counter. But to be fair with him, it still was kind of hard to translate how Bites the Dust worked here, so again, leave your comments below on what you think he'd do here. Depending on your guys' interpretation of his ability, he could be way more formidable than I'm giving him credit for here, at least with how I did it. As for Diavolo, the issue is no one's going to know he's a threat. His whole goal is to be anonymous. Like, people might know of his existence as the boss, but no one will really know who he is. And especially thanks to the vow that lets him turn into Doppio, and the fact that he could just catch people off guard with King Crimson, he might end up killing you when you least expect it. If you actually know when you're fighting him though, that's a different case. And you know to expect his attacks coming, especially if you could figure out how his domain works. Although it's weird to theorize how his ability will work with something like Infinity, for example. Since he's cutting out time, how does that affect Limitless here? With Dio at least he's completely stopping time, so against Gojo he actually might be able to get through Infinity, since the effects of it would stop with time itself. I didn't really mention this with the Dio part, but while Gojo's ability is automatic, it still does require some process in his brain to go on to activate it. So technically it is still manual in a way, and with a time stop that would mean it would just be negated, and Dio could get through it. As for King Crimson though, that's different. While he is deleting time, he's not just stopping it there. Things still do move and act in that deleted time, but it's basically on autopilot, so he might not be able to get through Gojo's Infinity there. And as I mentioned before, he doesn't really have the raw strength to carry him through some of the higher tiers, and the sneak attacks is a really big issue. But if he's going up against people who actually knows who he is, and he's not concealing his identity, they'd have to first survive and figure out what his ability's doing first. And once they do, some of the higher tiers could actually counter him. The special grades should have enough destructive power to stop him, and a good amount of Culling Game players too. And unless he hits you directly in the head and just completely destroys it, people with reverse curse technique could still survive through this somehow. I'd even say that people like Yuji could figure out a way around this, at least if he could figure out what's going on with King Crimson, and some of the really good fighters like Todo could even figure out a way around it too. In this deleted time, Diavolo basically is untouchable, so it's not like someone could figure out how to attack him during this, they'd have to do this after the fact. The trick is just surviving it when it happens. He could see Destiny with Epitaph, he could change where he is, and he's basically just becoming a non-factor in this fate that's supposed to happen. But if someone is fated to dodge him, for example, like I guess Todo using a Boogie Woogie, that's the biggest hurdle here. Plus, if you're too strong for him to kill in the first place, you're not really at risk here. Someone like Sukuna, for example. And not to mention, if he gets caught in one of their domains, it's still a guaranteed hit even if he's removing himself from time. So there are a good chunk of characters that could actually defeat him, or at least survive an encounter with him. Now on for Pucci. He's too fast for most sorcerers to hit, especially at his top speed. Even something like Curse Speech is useless here because he outspeeds sound. And at the higher end, he's even going to be able to dodge lightning from Kashimo, and any other attacks that come his way. In a way, he's also a direct counter for Yuki somewhat, because her ability might be useless here. Since he controls gravity, he could just remove all the virtual weight that she has. So yeah, she gives herself virtual mass, but then he just reduces the gravity on her, and essentially cancels it out. Pucci actually has a couple of ways to defeat Gojo too, and this applies to each version of him. Version 1's illusions might not work due to 6 eyes seeing through it, and he can't touch Gojo unless his domain lets him counter Infinity through gravity control somehow. Another way Pucci could kill people, which would include Gojo, is that maybe in his domain he could just speed up time for them specifically. He would accelerate the flow of time only for one person, or even just the area that they're standing in to get around Gojo's Infinity, for example. This is something he's done in JoJo. He did it just for a watch, he did it for some eggs, he did it for fingernails, so he could use this in a localized area. Which would mean, if he traps Gojo in a domain for example, he could speed up time just for Gojo. Now, it won't instantly make him an old man or anything, but his time acceleration grows exponentially. So at first it would be slow, but eventually, Gojo would be aged up so much that he'd just die from old age. And if he could just survive long enough without taking any attacks, in his domain, he could kill pretty much anyone this way. Which is really stupid when I say it like that, but that sounds like a really funny way to kill Gojo. He also might be able to control gravity to a point where he reverses the Infinity that Gojo's doing. Or he could change the gravity on Gojo himself, turning him inside out, which is a very gory and disgusting way to kill him, but still a way to kill him. Granted, that would require him to actually touch Gojo. Plus, since he infinitely accelerates time, even though he's going to be slowed down by infinity, what if he just infinitely accelerates the time around them? So Gojo's Limitless will infinitely slow him down, but he'll infinitely speed himself up through time. Even if he doesn't necessarily have infinite speed right off the bat, his infinite acceleration should at least counter Gojo's infinite deceleration, making it null and void and letting him get through Limitless. Essentially, he's doing to himself the inverse of what Limitless is trying to do to him. So there's probably a few ways for him to get through this. Although there still are ways to kill him, and even with his speed, if he gets trapped in a domain, still a guaranteed hit there. And given he doesn't have the destructive capabilities of some of the higher tiers in JJK, they would at least be able to resist some of his attacks. The issue is if they're hit directly by Sea Moon, and then parts of them are turned inside out. He would be really hard to hit by most though, but when trapped in a domain you should be able to hit him, and a lot of the higher tiers should have enough destructive force to kill him. So any of the special grade sorcerers, they'd have enough power and intelligence to find a way to actually counter this in some way. Now on to Valentine. He can kill anyone by bringing their alternate self towards them. The only issue would be Gojo. The two versions of Gojo would pull themselves towards each other, but they'd be stopped by Limitless, which might just completely immobilize them, but it would lead to a stalemate because Valentine would have ways to protect himself, and he can't kill Gojo here. But for everyone else, he has ways to kill them. The question is how other domains would interact with him, because while he could just replace himself with an alternate version of himself, since the domains would have the guaranteed attack affecting his soul, which one would it go after? Couldn't he just nullify this by swapping his soul into another version of himself? And if he does achieve Love Train, of course he's going to be untouchable by most. It would essentially work as a barrier against guaranteed hits as well. Overall, he's going to be one of the most fearsome opponents, really because his defense is a big concern. He has no massive offensive attack besides the variant merge. But he's also basically unkillable and has infinite energy. And finally, Tooru. In a sense, he's also like Gojo, except offensively. No one could attack him or even pursue him without Calamity activated. Now, the question is the upper end of Calamity. It's been shown to turn even harmless things into something harmful. But how far could that go? Because grade 1 sorcerers and above might actually have ways to counter this Calamity, and might even resist the destructive forces of it depending on its upper limit. Although Calamity does negate durability. So maybe there's a way to resist it, but again, the question is the upper limit of it. Could they just kill anyone who pursues him? And like the others, would this even get through Gojo's infinity? Not to mention, people could probably counter this just by regenerating with reverse curse technique. Not to mention, imaginary things are able to bypass this. Again, not going too much into Part 8 spoilers here, but this is one weakness of it. And you know what's imaginary in JJK? Hollow Purple. It's an imaginary technique. Given the fact that it's an imaginary mass, it might actually be able to harm Tooru without affecting Calamity. Actually, in a way, this might apply to Valentine as well with Love Train. But at least there, he could just create another version of himself. With Tooru, this might be able to just kill him right away. Plus, domains might actually be able to counter this ability thanks to a guaranteed hit. And going to the Joestar clan of sorcerers, Johnny and Gappy would be able to get through this easily. They're perfect counters for him. He's untouchable by most, but someone like Gojo might be able to hit him, or Maharaga could even adapt to this. Of course, this all applies to Valentine as well, but unlike Valentine, Tooru's not just going to be able to replicate himself here. Once you hit him, you actually hit him. Valentine might actually find ways to redirect the damage, or at least just create a new version of himself. And interestingly enough, since Calamity ties somewhat into luck, he also could perfectly counter Hikari, who wouldn't be able to hit Jackpot. Not only would Calamity be able to kill him, but Wonder Review's Calamity could actually affect luck as well. Hikari would have a hard time killing him anyway, but this is just worth mentioning because he'd be a perfect counter for that too, and would negate that ability. That makes him a luck negator. Where have I heard that before? But that basically covers everything. So it seems like Kars and Valentine would be the most effective here, given their specific abilities and strengths, as well as with Valentine how hard it is to actually attack him. And with Kars how durable he is. Pucci's also very formidable too, but there's still ways to get around him. To some extent this applies to Tooru as well, but not to the extent of Kars or Valentine, whose abilities would be much more overpowered in this verse. As for the others, they still would have a good chance, but there's a multitude of ways to defeat them, and multiple sorcerers capable of doing it. And I guess that's all. And remember, this is all just a fun theoretical video of putting JoJo characters into JoJo-tsu Kaisen. It's not accurate power scaling at all. But let me know what you think below. Would any of these people have different abilities? Are there people who should be stronger? Are there people who should be weaker? Or is there anything I missed in terms of characters that should defeat them? Be sure to drop a like and subscribe if you haven't already, because it shows me you want to see more videos like this. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you on the next video.